Welcome to the Australian Azure User Group for March 2021.
Just to say hello, so we have Ozzy Tarrant from Showtime Consulting. We have Nick Price as well. I'll bring Nick on screen too.
Hey everyone, how you going?
So Nick and I both actually work for Microsoft. We run this community, and Ozzy is our special guest today, who has been doing some cool things with Azure Stack, and will tell us a little bit about it today. Nick, next slide. That's very 2021.
Very 2021.
All right, so what are we doing with our community here? So we want to build a community that's about learning and sharing. We don't want this to be a sales-heavy thing. So Ozzy's presentation is going to go deep into teaching you about the whole opportunity of running Azure in disconnected, running it in your own data center. So we want others to put their hand up and present. It's a safe forum. We want you to feel welcome to come and show and tell, basically. So the link's there if you want to join in. All right, so I might just hand over to Nick to start talking a little bit about a major event that's coming up.
Thanks, Stu. As some of you may not be aware, we have Microsoft Ignite, which starts tomorrow morning at 3 a.m. with Sachi's key sort of there on at Ignite, but some really cool things that have dropped just before Ignite that we thought worth mentioning. We have a new version of Firewall Premium, which has got, outbound TLS inspection. So the ability to look inside encrypted traffic that's going around in your network, which is really helpful if you have to meet some regulatory compliance sort of things around that. Intrusion detection and prevention. So this really ties into the whole Azure Defender ecosystem, and you can tie it into Sentinel, so you can really get that end-to-end view across all of your network traffic. URL filtering, like a traditional proxy would, so you can allow certain categories of web traffic. Maybe you want to allow gambling and not allow books or something like that. You can do that with a bunch of predefined categories that are there that come from various feeds that we have. And yeah, I guess this is going to be really exciting for Azure Premium because it's going to really enable like a lot of things where traditional proxy may have done some of this. We've now got this capability directly into the firewall. So also on that, in a similar thread, Firewall Manager, which is the firewall component which helps enable Azure Firewall inside vWAN, has got some other additional exciting things coming up. So inter-hub support for vWAN, which is something that I think a lot of people are really keen for. UDR, default route automation for hub VNet support, so you don't have to go through and manually set those UDRs on those hub VNets that are connected through to that. And there's some other announcements that are going to come out at Ignite that I'm really excited about that I think you should all definitely check out in this sort of similar vein. So, and one last one, I wouldn't be me if I wasn't talking about Active Directory somehow. Some other cool things coming in the Active Directory space. So identity protection for external identities. So anyone using B2B or B2C directories, you can use identity protection on those sorts of SKUs there as well. Header-based authentication for Azure AD App Proxy. If you've got apps that are expecting a certain header claim to come with the user to talk about them and to describe what they can do or who they are, you can now enable access to those sorts of apps through an app proxy. Yeah, I think that is all of the news that I had. Stu, is there another slide here?
Yes, there is, Nick.
All right.
Okay. So there's a new-ish feature now. It's been around since September. We announced at the last Ignite. So we have Logic Apps preview. Now, what is this? This is where you can develop and run Logic Apps in more places, basically in Kubernetes, in Linux containers. This is very cool. You can also develop in VS Code, which is Visual Studio Code, which is the free editor to download, install, and use. So that's a great opportunity, and that sort of gives you an insight into where Microsoft's going, running the Logic Apps closer to your data center, closer to the edge.
That's really cool. So does that mean I would be able to run them in an environment that I may not necessarily need something like an ISE to run those in?
Absolutely. So there's an opportunity there for people to maybe run them within something like Azure App Service, and that will be
Or AKS maybe?
Or AKS.
Yeah.
Azure
Very cool.
Kubernetes Service. So you can run them in different places now. And I think that'll open up a whole bunch of new scenarios for people.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
So next slide, please, Nick. Next slide. So Azure Front Door. So we've had Azure Front Door. Microsoft have been running it internally for a long time in front of Azure, Office 365, Dynamics. So what have we done there? We've launched Azure Front Door in previous years to our customers so that you can use it as an application delivery network, layer 7 load balancing, a WAF. It's cross-region, uses the Microsoft backbone. We now have a new rule set for that, which is the Microsoft default rule set, which sounds very nerdy. What does that actually mean? That means that it leverages Microsoft's threat intelligence and some of the global security investment in Microsoft. And so that allows you to have an easier experience tuning your web application firewall rules to protect your critical workloads. Now, there's a new view, or there's a public preview of something we call Azure Front Door Standard and Premium. Again, web application firewall support, bot protection, DDoS protection, and you can secure the backends with private links, which is something I'm particularly excited about because that unlocks some scenarios where you've got private links into maybe an app service or storage. You can access that straight through Azure Front Door. And I think that's a great opportunity to optimize costs for some of our larger customers.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, now we have a gentleman, Ozzy Terran. He will be coming through now. He's the main presentation of the day. So Ozzy, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself to people? I know you've got a presentation here. I'll add into the stream.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look, I'll do the intro in a second. I'll firstly just say, look, thanks for the cool image. Obviously, it's a pretty exciting time. We can do Azure Stack Hub and run Azure in your own data center. It's probably been around for about 3 years now, but the latest iterations have been pretty cool. And the feature set that I think we wanted to be able to do things like virtual data center on an Azure Stack Hub are out now. So that's pretty good. I think the other big thing that I'm excited about at the moment is the fact that Microsoft's won that JEDI contract. I think there's going to be a lot more investment into the platform over the next 12 to 24 months. And I think for anybody who's involved with Azure Stack Hub at the moment, it's going to be an interesting time, and hopefully we'll see a lot of features released in the next 2 years. So with that, I'll get in and do a bit of an intro. So just quickly, a bit of my background to say, where I'm coming from. I've been involved in cloud and private cloud for probably about the last 10 years. Started very early with Hyper-V, Virtual Machine Manager, building clouds out that way. I sort of graduated on to some engagements using Windows Azure Pack and did some of the first software-defined networks that actually Azure and Azure Stack built on. Yep. So that was, obviously a really great experience for me. And then moved on to doing some hybrid cloud gigs with New Zealand Defence, where we did a hybrid cloud with Azure and Azure Stack Hub, where we were able to use things like Azure DevOps to replicate workloads, not only workloads, but infrastructure as code between Azure and Azure Stack Hub, which I think is one of the major selling points for Azure Stack Hub as well, the ability to leverage that cloud platform. Obviously, I worked with you guys as a cloud solution architect in the CSU before branching out by myself. And during that time, I was also involved in the CSU as an Azure Stack champ and got across a lot of opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I think more recently, I've had a lot more hands-on with a lot of the hardware partners. So I could sort of talk to that a little bit more now at the moment anyway. Yeah. The other thing that we're currently working on at the moment, so I'm currently engaged by Defence across a risk reduction activity on Azure Stack Hub, and we're currently working with Microsoft Global Engineering for a proof of concept for the intelligence community. And just knowing me, obviously got a few exams up there, but the education obviously and the learning never stops. So I'm still going through our Masters in Cloud Computing at Charles Sturt University, which has been great for me, and sometimes just good to get out of your own headspace and do something else. So, and if you want to get in touch with me, reach out on the LinkedIn link there.
Fantastic.
So a quick overview on what we're going to sort of cover today is, I think, some of the architectural musts. And there's some things when we talk about Azure Stack Hub that I think people really need to get their heads across. We'll talk about disconnected deployments, hardware partners, tools, and we'll do some Q&A at the end of the session as well. And we might talk about, if anybody has any ideas about anything any topics they really want to dig into, and people maybe want to see me again after this, we might dig in and do another session after that. So architectural musts, look, we'll go through this at a high level, why Azure Stack Hub, really working out what your business requirement is, how to frame the cloud computing conversation. This is something I see people struggle with, and I've got a couple of resources there for people. Azure Stack Hub is a cloud platform, infrastructure rails, and obviously you can read through the rest of this slide and sort of see what we're doing. This is my first time doing this presentation, and we've got quite a few things to cover, but we'll make sure that we tick off on all these important points, and then we'll get into the rest of the presentation and maybe do some Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions as we're going through, make sure to write them down and maybe just ask them at the end. So why Azure Stack Hub? So I think it's a really good question as you kick off into your Azure Stack Hub journey, is like starting to ask yourself, what's your driver to really deploy Azure Stack Hub? And the first ones that come up are the edge and disconnected scenarios. And then obviously there's another one down the bottom there for cloud apps that might meet sort of varied regulations. That might even be something like data sovereignty. So I don't know, for people who have customers that might be overseas, it might be the ability to run their own workloads within their own country, but still be connected to Azure. So, but the main one and the one I commonly see, especially in Canberra and around town and for the Defence Forces, is the disconnected story. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. I think the interesting thing here with this conversation is, like most people say, start with why. As Simon Sinek's books gets quoted all the time, but I love Viktor Frankl's, when you know your why, you can endure it anyhow. And Azure Stack Hub is a large deployment. I don't want to sort of make it out to be too easy. But you've got to bring the rest of the organisation along for this change. And I know if you've been in a cloud computing public story, generally we have to bring the security people along, the operations people along, and let me think, who am I missing? Some service management people along. It's a similar story with Azure Stack Hub. So, so I sort of say, look, when you know your why, you can endure anyhow. I find that pretty useful to get through these deployments. Let me just take on to the next slide. Let's give everyone a chance to read this, and I don't want to scare anybody, but this is from the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud with Azure and Azure Stack. A really good quote about how to go about deploying your environment. And the one I've got highlighted in here is understanding the business of your end users and needs. So what we want to be doing is not just introducing another technology that's maybe going to be doing virtualization. We want to make sure that we really dial in on working out what the problem that we're trying to solve with Azure Stack Hub. And for me, it needs to be a business requirement. And if you can't find out what that business requirement is, generally my best advice is to bring a business analyst in, determine what the business needs, align with the business needs, and use the solutions to solve. Use cloud solutions to solve those problems on Azure Stack Hub. So for me, it's not really a replacement for virtualization. You want to use it for, the cloud platform for other things, not just direct virtualization, but you want to start to have that conversation about how you're going to start using cloud computing as a platform. And that brings me on to my next slide, which is around really understanding, and I find commonly, I think across probably the 10 or so opportunities that I've been across, is how the cloud computing conversation gets framed is something that people struggle with. And to tell you the truth, there's a link on here from Red Hat, and the table here on the right, on the right is from Red Hat as well, which has got a really good a walkthrough if you're struggling with this, about how to get yourself maybe out of the virtualization mindset into a cloud computing sort of mindset. And you can see it's a sort of technology versus a methodology, and sort of scalable, and multiple tenancies and things like that. But the the big thing for me is, the ability to sort of group resources here. The other link that I've got below, and I'll just let people maybe copy that or take a screenshot of that, is actually a great blog by the product team, which just talks about Azure Stack is an IaaS service, and it sort of points out the difference between delivering an IaaS service and a virtualization service. But I don't want to dig into this too much because we've got a few things to cover, but I'll just give people a second to get that, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So what I find is when we start the Azure Stack Hub conversation, and this is probably a big slide with a lot of things on it, so I'll let people read it as I walk through, but what I find is there's a lot of products out there that sort of do similar things. So on the left here, we've got sort of traditional public Azure, and we can see that, it's sort of got the whole stack of services that we need. But then on the right, we've got, Azure Stack Hub, Azure Stack HCI, and Azure Stack Edge, which is sort of a portfolio of products that cover a lot of different functionality and some of the same functionality. So when I have that conversation with people about really understanding what their business requirement is, it really comes down to determining what is driving them to use Azure Stack Hub, because you can see Azure Stack Edge actually has quite a few of the same features that you can run as Azure Stack Hub. But the differentiator for me is the ability to use that cloud platform and have a cloud platform that's got a parity with Azure, and to be able to sort of, to use that platform to maybe, especially say maybe in a defense context or in some type of security context where you can work with maybe unclassified resources in public cloud, then reap their knowledge into some type of DevOps type tool or some type of Git repository, copy that over maybe via a diode into another environment, and then repeat that same technology on the other side. So that, for me, that's probably one of the biggest things. The ARM templates obviously work the same as they do in Azure, and the cloud fabric or the cloud platform that you're using runs all the same services as Azure. So you get your Azure portal, you get your ARM templates, you're able to connect up via Visual Studio to deploy and run pipelines and do all those types of things. And so it's really, really powerful as an infrastructure as code, but maybe for some of the machine learning and video analytics and Kubernetes workloads, maybe some of those other things you might want to think about using maybe Azure Stack Edge. We're not going to sort of drill into Edge at the moment, but I just wanted to make sure that people understood, I guess, Azure Stack Hub is a tool in your toolbox which meets some requirements. And I like to think of it as the hammer, but there's other tools in your toolbox to meet things. So Azure Stack HCI is probably the screwdriver, and Edge is a little bit more agile. I like to think of it as the tack hammer, where we can sort of take it into smaller places and solve different workloads. Now, the next slide I've got here is just around, and it's probably a little bit small for people, but I just wanted to, a lot of time when I talk to people about the cloud platform, they don't really understand, what's this cloud platform? Is it just, something that's deployed to, that's part of the actual install of Azure Stack Hub? The cloud platform is actually a bunch of VMs, and we can see here that, if we look at these infrastructure roles, all of these infrastructure roles are actually managed by VMs that actually sit on top of the hardware and deliver services. So some of these services you can see in here down the bottom, we've got Key Vault, but some of the other services, the portal, the administrator portal, and all those types of things are part of that cloud fabric. So probably the important note here is definitely like when you do an Azure Stack Hub deployment, you're deploying this cloud fabric that sits on top of the virtualization layer. There's two call outs here. One, it takes quite a bit of resource to run this cloud fabric. And two, there's an orchestrated startup of this cloud fabric, which takes a little bit of time to actually start up before you can actually access Azure Stack Hub and the workloads inside it. So it's just something to be mindful of. If you're trying to do a solution, then you need sort of that Hyper-V or, a Nutanix type startup time. This cloud platform might not be the solution for you. And given that, and I guess the other side of that, if you're sort of comparing a single server, Azure Stack Hub generally comes with 4 servers. So even if you have a machine restart, all those servers will be taken over to the other side. So my next slide just sort of covers off the parity conversations. I think I've sort of dug into a little bit with you already. You can see at the base, like that infrastructure is basically the same. We've got the ability, that parity with Azure gives us the ability to have IaaS and Azure PaaS workloads in a consistent manner across both. I think the gotcha there a little bit with Azure Stack Hub, and as Azure's hyperscale cloud, it's 100 servers added at a time in hyperscale cloud. We're talking about some deployments with Azure Stack that goes sort of from 4 to 16 nodes. So you're going to see slight differences in some of the things that you're able to do. And moreover, like I said, the maturity of some of the products, especially around things like Kubernetes, the full feature set isn't there as compared to public cloud. So there's slight nuances that are the difference. At the Azure Resource Manager layer, one thing I will call out is the Azure ARM template, the Azure ARM APIs are always a little bit behind. There's an Azure template validator that you can use to validate that you're in the right ARM templates when you're working with things like that. But that's a gotcha for, I guess, new people to the platform. And then obviously, the portal experience is basically the same. PowerShell experience is basically the same. And the DevOps tools that you use, like Azure DevOps and Visual Studio Code and things like that, still connect up and work in the same way. So the great thing is you're able to repeat those workloads across the different environments. Okay, so this is a slide that I've taken a few customers through, which I think is just a really good place to start around, maybe perhaps understanding your information environment a little bit more before you madly go out and try and start deploying Azure Stack Hub, because I do see a lot of people go out and buy this product without actually thinking about how they're going to use it, or they want to be able to buy this product and solve all their problems with this one product. And I think there's a good story in this. If you sort of look at the different scenarios within your environment, and I think you can tell from this slide, it looks like a defense environment. And I think most people's, like larger organizations look like this. They've got some type of data center over on the left. They might have a branch office or some other type of fixed location, next to that. Then they might have some type of mobile capacity, or the need to maybe set up a temporary site somewhere. And then they might have vehicles, which are, like out roaming around, where they might want to either crunch data, or they might want to give people access back into their internal network. And then obviously you've got people who might be out there on the ground, and I think what I like to do is sort of lay out all those scenarios and sort of match up what type of technology will I use to meet that requirement. So I think Azure Stack Hub could work all the way out to the mobile edge, but I think there's a lot of scenarios where, depending on what your business requirement is, and if it's more of a machine learning or cognitive services type service, I'd be leaning a little bit more towards the Azure Stack Edge type of appliance. But and if it's something sort of fairly simple where you just want to run, like say a couple of VMs, you'd be running towards something like Azure Stack HCI. But if it's something where you want to run, I guess, the hybrid goodness of all that, and be able to maybe iterate out and run cloud applications natively, like say web apps and PaaS type databases, and really want to modernize your compute, and then Azure Stack Hub is the real key to solving that problem. Just change slides again. So this is the shared responsibility model that we see for Azure. Like I say, I've just sort of made a bit of an update down the bottom here, but I think the important thing to point out here to people around that shared responsibility model is the fact that now when you deploy Azure Stack Hub, you're actually responsible for everything. So obviously you buy the appliance. Usually when you're using public cloud, Microsoft is sitting there working away in the back end, and they're taking care of those physical hosts, the physical network, the physical data center. That's now your responsibility, so same with the services, like some of those services that you're delivering to end users and resource providers and things like that. It's your responsibility to manage those things. I think one thing I did want to call out here is, you need to go into this with a really clear approach about how you're going to manage this environment. And we used to have some really great guides, I think, when we did Windows Azure Pack around product line architecture guides for private cloud. And we used to sort of call this a fabric type environment. We used to get a fabric team to manage it. Now, look, I think you'd call that maybe your Azure Stack Hub administrators or operators who would manage this environment and then pass services out to your customers or other departments or other areas in your team. The other thing to call out is just the fact that I've supported DXC, and I think Abinard also have managed services for administering and operating your Azure Stack Hub. So if you just want to consume maybe the goodness of Azure in your private environment, then I'd say maybe look at reaching out to one of these partners for one of their managed services where they've got some IP around this and they can deliver that type of managed service for you. Azure Stack Hub resource providers. So it's hard to, some of these apps and services, are quite big presentations in themselves, but I just thought I'd call out some of the bigger ones here, like obviously App Service, Event Hubs, IoT Hub, MySQL, SQL, and Kubernetes are all things that that you can deploy that become part of the Azure Stack Hub fabric. And that's great. Obviously you're able to leverage them. I think the big plus here, for me, a lot of these things are great, but especially with Kubernetes, just knowing what a Kubernetes deployment is, you get a stamp to be able to stamp out your Kubernetes on your Azure Stack Hub that's basically managed by the fabric, which is great. I think the flag here is if you want to do these services, the thing is you're going to have to manage them. You're going to have to work out perhaps how you're going to back up these services on the back end. And it's a really good talking point about, I guess, what you want in your environment and how you're going to manage it and what type of tools you're going to use to perhaps manage some of these things. I'm not going to dig into this too deeply today, but like I said, maybe we can talk about some of these things and dig into them a little bit deeper.
So, a question that I have for you is just do you find that it's the traditional infrastructure teams that are looking to run and manage these as the next iteration of their infrastructure in these sorts of environments, or does this tend to be different infrastructure teams that are interested in running this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. So, and I guess one of the things in that product line architecture guide, we really talked about in the earlier version when we were doing Windows Azure Pack about sort of consolidating some of those infrastructure teams, the traditional compute, network and storage guys into one team. It might be a fabric team or it might be an administrator's team, because basically what we've got now is with Azure Stack Hub, we've got our networks, storage and compute all combined into one appliance, don't we? So, yeah. And we need some specialists to run it. So I think, and I call it out, I think in a couple of slides time, education around the platform is key. So what I see is technically it's quite easy if you know what you're doing to be able to drop these solutions off, but there's quite a large learning curve to actually come up to speed with some of these things. And like I said, the infrastructure teams, depending on where they are and what they've had exposure to, would have to maybe ramp up on some of these things as well. But the strategy is a good question. So how do we support these things? And I think carving out a couple of people or a team to look after the actual deployment of this infrastructure and management of the infrastructure is pretty important. So I'm just pointing this out. I'm pretty sure most people here probably know about Azure Virtual Data Center or the VDC. We've got the ability to replicate that same fabric, and that's the point I want to make here in Azure Stack Hub. VNet peering is finally available in Azure Stack Hub, so you can create multiple subscriptions, have multiple VNets, and do all the same things you do in Azure. So if in Azure you have 5 subscriptions, 1 hub subscription and 3 spokes, you can do the same thing across your Azure Stack Hub as well. I won't dig into this one too much. I think it's probably pretty self-explanatory. And I've got an example of a deployed environment coming up, so I'll talk to that slide a little bit more when it comes up. So just here I've highlighted a few things which I see as challenges. I know we've touched on a couple of them, but organizationally, when I start talking to people about Azure Stack Hub, I straight away tell them that there's probably sort of 3 other streams of work you need to start focusing on. One is security, and making sure the security people understand what you're doing from a security perspective. Suddenly we've got an appliance moving in that not only just plugs into the network and gets a group of IP addresses, but we've got this elastic cloud on top of it that might be hybridized with your environment, that has maybe more IP addressing, more security concerns, other types of appliances that can be rolled out at the marketplace. Security conversation, I can't highlight it more highly enough, needs to happen sooner rather than later. So if you're looking into one of these projects, either try and have that conversation early, or try and just bring your security people along as you go through and start doing your planning. Service management and operations, like this is another one. You're plugging a new piece of technology and probably a new way of working into the environment. It can spin people out a little bit. Like I said, it's better to bring these people along. Typically, when I was at Microsoft and doing these types of engagements, we'd sit there and do, perhaps a week of workshops in education, just to bring people along for the journey, make sure they understand and they're comfortable with things, but also get some collaboration around some of the decisions that are being made and why. I think some of the people looking at some of the technical decisions can leave these people out, and the operations components and how this fits into your service management is a pretty vital component, and how you're going to operate this when it goes to cloud. Otherwise, you'll have a great technical solution that nobody uses if you don't engage these people. And education is probably one that I'll just flag. I mean, what type of education do you need to run Azure Stack Hub? So, I mean, I think there's one exam out for it at the moment, and that sort of aims to more the administration of the actual Azure Stack Hub appliance. I would say what you're looking for people to work on this actual platform is basically the same skills as what you have in Azure. So the great thing is like, if you've got good Azure people, they can come over and work on this platform pretty quickly. It's the same skill set. They're able to deploy the same things, and that's the other value of the cloud platform as well. So you're actually maybe double dipping on your Azure people twice. Nick?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to ask, what if I've got good infrastructure people that are sort of maybe used to running a traditional 3-tier infrastructure environment? I've got SAN, I've got a bunch of servers, and virtualization layer and that sort of stuff. Is there space, do you think, to bring these sort of people up to speed and get them learning how something like Azure Stack Hub works?
Definitely. So I think it just comes to, it's not so much reskilling, but it's just learning a new way of doing perhaps the same things. And I think people sometimes go to introduce a technology and other people think, oh, maybe these people won't be needed anymore. But you're still running them basically 90% of the time, similar or the same workloads, which are going to need the same people around to support them, aren't they? And then what you're doing is you're just doing it perhaps in maybe a more modernized way, or maybe in a more scalable way that you can work with that team. But that's an education story that I think most infrastructure people should be used to. I mean, IT is a constantly changing platform, and this is a new platform that they can learn and still run the same type of VM workloads. And just because so many times when I start the licensing conversation, I've got this up here. This can take a while for people to get their heads around, and I've got a slide on licensing next just to highlight it with people. But with Azure Stack Hub licensing, there's basically 2 ways of licensing. So the first is pay-as-you-go, and I'll just point out the pay-as-you-go is really simple. If you're connected to the internet, you basically either install ADFS, install Azure AD, and you connect to that subscription, and you're able to then use pay-as-you-go billing on your Azure Stack Hub. There's a calculator online. Make sure you put in Azure Stack Hub calculator. It's exactly the same as the Azure pricing calculator. And there's an Azure Stack pricing calculator that you can get online, and you can go through and see what the workload costs are. Obviously, it's significantly cheaper than Azure in a way, because you're paying for the infrastructure up front and you're paying for the cloud fabric. It's not costing you the same as what it costs you to run a VM in Azure, but there's a cost associated with it. The other piece on licensing here is around in disconnected mode. So you've got this capacity model, and capacity model is dependent on using cores in these machines that are available to work out licensing and billing. So basically, you're paying a fixed rate per core, And it's dependent on what your EA agreement is. I know that Microsoft quotes, I think, $400 per core. It's a good, I think, it's a good way to maybe work out what your pricing is. But I think, especially in Canberra and some of our government clients who've got their own EAs, they actually get that at a different price. But you need to think about this when you're actually, and we'll dig into that around the hardware section. You need to think about this when you're developing your hardware, because you are paying perhaps in disconnected per core. So if you really scoped in on what your business requirement is, what type of capacity model you need, you don't need to over provision and perhaps pay a lot more for licensing than what you need to. I'll just, so next we'll sort of dig into disconnected deployments. I might just have a quick drink of water.
So Ozzy, one thing that's new to me there is that you pay in as you buy the device, you don't own all the software license out the box. I guess you're paying for the software upgrades and so forth that come through conceptually when you use Stack, right? It's because it's billable in the same way as the Azure platform itself, the public cloud. Yeah. So that was a bit of a surprise to me, but I guess that pricing model makes sense when you think about the patching and the investment and you get in the newest of it. You upgrade it there.
I guess it's,
you grab the CD-ROM and install it, Nick. Or
well, I was going to say, I guess it's similar to what we do if we buy data center SKUs for virtualization to license Windows Server. And that Except that if we're not in a disconnected mode, from what I understand, like we can actually pay for what we use at that point in time on a per core basis, as opposed to everything all the time.
Yeah, I think
so. The elasticity is built into the pricing there in terms of like it's how much you use. Right?
Correct.
Right.
I think, and I just forgot to maybe point this one out. So there's a basic, like obviously pay as you go is pretty straightforward. When you register Azure Stack Hub, it registers against an Azure subscription, and that pay as you go billing goes out to your Azure subscription, right? So for you guys, you'll be interested in it because you get some Azure consumed revenue. But in the other model that we've got, the capacity model, it's actually not billed to the Azure subscription. You register with the Azure subscription, but it's actually billed to the customer's EA agreement, and it actually gets billed as Windows Server, which I think is sort of really interesting. And they get billed. That bill comes in as at true up time on their subscription. And there's also two packages there, which is the IaaS package, which is just to run, say, IaaS type workloads on your Azure Stack Hub. And obviously, depending on what your business requirements are, and because we're all good people, we'll have clear business requirements. Yes. We'll maybe look to either run the IaaS package or the app service package, which includes all those app services, and I think the higher value services that really flush out the Azure Stack Hub story. So we'll jump on to disconnected deployments. We're not doing too badly for time. I think we'll get through this. So quickly, this is from the Microsoft website. It sort of talks about whether you're connected or disconnected or connected to Azure, and down the bottom in red, we've got our disconnected scenarios, and up the top there, we've got our connected scenarios. I'll just point out, with disconnected, you can only use ADFS for authentication against a disconnected Azure Stack Hub. And if you're fully disconnected from the internet, you can see that there's up the top and there's the connected scenarios you can deploy with ADFS. But if you're fully disconnected from the internet, your only real option for billing is the capacity model at the moment. Obviously, if you're connected to the internet, you can use Azure AD or ADFS as the identity store. You can deploy using Azure AD. You can use consumption billing or capacity-based billing. And I think that pretty much covers that slide anyway. But if you want, obviously, just jump over to the link, and that digs into that topic a little bit more. The other thing is in a disconnected scenario, and I think we've got a link here, maybe I'll share it later. Some of the features of Azure Stack Hub are impaired. So, and some of the features are sort of maybe things that you're not going to be too concerned about. It might be when I go in to look at an object, maybe a load balancer, and when I click the link to say get more help or go to a web link, obviously that web link's not going to work on that object. But there are other things in there that are gotchas, and we might be able to dig into that in another session. I wanted to take people through and talk to this slide a little bit, and this is an example of a disconnected Azure Stack Hub deployment in a single region. So when you deploy, I'll just talk about single region for a second. Every Azure Stack Hub deployment is a single region. You can deploy multiple Azure Stack Hubs in the same organization, and they'll all be considered as a single region. So there's no concept at the moment of actually having multi-region perhaps. That being said, you should be careful with naming, obviously, but if you're going to do multiple Azure Stack Hubs, but there's no concept of actually joining these things together and getting things like backup recovery vaults and things like that going at the moment. So you actually do need to, if you're going to run multiple Azure Stack Hubs, start thinking about using partner products and things like that. But I've sort of skewed offline a little bit there, and I'll just talk to this slide a little bit. So over on the left here, we've got our on-premise environment. I'll just talk to these servers that I've got highlighted in orange. So there are 3 requirements that we need to be able to deploy Azure Stack Hub in one of these places are AD. So we've got a couple of domain controllers there, DC1 and DC2. We need ADFS, because ADFS is going to be used to integrate with the portal and the administrator portal so we can gain access. And we need PKI for certificates for our environment. And there's, I think about, last count, I think about 15 certificates that you need to generate. There's advice on the Microsoft websites about how to do these things when you go for the Azure Stack Hub integration. I think I've sort of pointed out a couple of these things on the next slide. But doing that integration into your environment means that you've got this Azure Stack Hub 4 node, which is sitting in the middle appliance with its top of rack switches connected to a border router that's now integrated with your environment. Now, in the middle here, you can see there's a line for Azure Stack public IPs. Much the same as Azure, if you want to get into these subscriptions and you want to get into these virtual networks that are living over here on the right, and we've got our production network hub here for Contoso, you need to create some type of bridge from your network into that environment. So you need to use a public IP address or the concept of a public IP address. Public IP is not public to the internet. Public IP is something that's facing out public from Azure Stack Hub. So public IP will allow you to create a jump spot from your router perhaps to a VPN gateway, so then you can access your IaaS workloads. And public IP is also a way to expose things like load balancers, so you can load balance maybe web applications and share web applications out that way.
Is that like a publicly addressable IP address range, or is it within the private range? I guess that's the point of confusion when we think about something disconnected.
Yeah, and that's
RFC compliant with the definition of public, or?
Yeah, so when you did your deployment worksheet with Azure Stack Hub and part of the integration, when you work with your hardware partner, whether it be Cisco, Dell, or I don't know, Lenovo, or who have I left out, HPE, you fill in a deployment worksheet which basically has a range of IP addressing that's allocated to the Azure Stack Hub. One of those ranges is basically a private to your network address range of IPs that will be used for public IPs on the Azure Stack Hub. You only get so many of those IPs that you can allocate. And off the top of my head at the moment, I'm forgetting how many there are, but I'm thinking it's lower than a Class B. So there's a bunch of IPs there that you can use. So you want to be careful. I've seen a couple of people go out and maybe put a public IP address on all their VMs to gain access because they don't have perhaps a virtual network gateway into that virtual network. Virtual network gateway is something that you want to sort of think about straight away when you're standing up your subscriptions. Yeah. You don't necessarily need to have a site-to-site virtual network gateway. You can still do point-to-site. So you can have people with perhaps laptops who create a connection from their laptop to the gateway, and then they can access the VMs from there in the first instance. But later on, it's pretty much the same as running your own Azure public cloud in your environment. So you're going to have some type of bridge there. Instead of maybe being express route, you've got a virtual network gateway. Maybe it's from the router, maybe it's from another firewall that basically bridges you into that environment so you can gain access to the VMs and the services in that environment. Sorry.
Nick, I think did you have a question? It looked like you were going to ask a question there.
Yeah,
it was about SCCM and so forth.
I've actually got a question from someone in the audience, which is great. So, what are the default management and protection services that Azure Stack deploys as part of the appliance? So we mentioned earlier, you mentioned that there was the PAD, the FS, PKI, and that sort of stuff. If I'm used to managing a Windows suite with things like SCCM, SCOM, DPM and that sort of stuff, does all of that stuff get deployed as well, or is that on me to, as the Stack Ops administrator person, to kind of figure out how I'm going to do all of those platform services that in Azure we use Azure Monitor and backup?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. I'll just try and think about how to pick it off a little bit. But I think the first thing to understand is when we deploy our 4-node Azure Stack appliance, and it's an appliance, even though it's say 4 to 16 servers and a couple of top-rack switches and a couple of maybe other switches and a hardware lifecycle host, that is actually managed by as an appliance. There's a whole stack of security controls, and there's links if you find them on the internet. I know Microsoft Trust has links on some of the certifications that Azure Stack Hub meets. So Azure Stack Hub meets the same certifications as Azure, basically. Like, so a lot of that security around, say, perhaps the hardware that's there. I know that as part of the deployment, the vendors actually roll out when they do the deployment things like, not perhaps network access control, but all the switches have config applied to them, so you can't use ports that aren't used, that certain ACLs are being applied to actually manage those things. As an administrator...
So is that that's on physical hardware that constitutes the stack itself? Yeah,
that's correct. So the 4 servers, the switches, are all deployed in this hardened fashion. So a couple of times we've rolled out Azure Stack Hub as an appliance, and people go, look, we want to push our maybe backup agent onto one of these servers. No, you can't do that. Yeah. We want to push maybe McAfee antivirus onto one of these. It's a hardened appliance, the whole deployment.
Black box.
It's a black box. Yeah. Definitely the workloads are treated a little bit differently, and some of the resource provider workloads are treated a little bit differently. But from the actual physical servers, no, it's a hardened appliance. There's not too much you can do with it. The patching, the story there, like where we've got config manager, or as I like to call it, conflict manager, is is a little bit different. So you still patch in a disconnected scenario. You patch your VMs maybe with WSUS and config manager. But in a Azure Stack actually has a patching regime that you need to keep up with. And it's probably an important point here, actually. So you need to be within 3 version updates of the current patching to actually be in a supported fashion. These patches are actually released at the websites. Some of them can actually be up to, I think, maybe a couple of gigabytes in size. They need to be downloaded. They're actually brought over, copied into a file share, and then once they're, I think a file share, it's actually blob storage where you can actually put these updates down and go through the update process of the actual Stack appliance as well. I'm pretty sure that comes close to maybe. Oh, sorry, I didn't touch on the operations tools. So, and I've got a slide in here talking about that a little bit later on. But yeah, look, some of these operations tools, whether it be Ops Manager, Nagios, I'm trying to think of another one.
Like Grafana or something like that.
Well, yeah, I don't know about those, the Grafana, but yeah, I definitely know like some of these other tools have, Ops Manager has a management pack, and Nagios has an extension for Azure Stack Hub where you can actually plug in and manage the admin, the health of the system basically, and administer the health of the system. And I might leave that when we get through to the other slides, because I've got some of those tools and management tools highlighted in another slide.
We've jumped ahead here a little, haven't we? But thanks, Ozzy, for answering that question. I've asked our viewers to ask if they need anything demystifying, because we're in deep tech land here. Acronyms, but like it's from my view, I think really Have you got something coming up later about how I can learn more? You know, can I go and buy a stack from JB Hi-Fi and get going with it, or probably not?
Yeah,
You know, like, can I?
Yeah, so
Is that something you cover?
I might have to put the brake on you here, Stu. So we do have we're coming up to talking about hardware partners in a second.
Yeah.
I think we'll dig into that conversation a little bit more. And I think one thing I will say at the moment is there's a lot of things written on the Microsoft sites around Azure Stack and how it's deployed and configured and all those types of things. And there's a big story there with each of these vendors on how some of this stuff might be managed, or what you can do with some of this hardware, how you can get it, also how you might be able to maintain it as well. So let me dig into that when we get up to the slide. And I'll just, and literally it's the next slide after this one. And I think we've already covered off a lot of this. So we sort of talked about some of these things in the data center integration. Obviously, identity is key. And when we talk about security, identity is the new boundary. So we need to make sure that that's a piece that we get right. Network, something to think about is when you actually connect up to your border router, you need to have those conversations with some of your infrastructure network folks around routing. Like most people use BGP, but you might use static routing. ASNs, like say 16 and 32-bit ASNs, it seems like something that's quite trivial, but and a lot of the time it can be trivial. But I've run into people that have had issues because they've actually had, I think, their 16-bit ASN range used up. But there's actually workarounds for some of those things. So I think Microsoft's got a post on that somewhere. VPNs are definitely something that's important. So, I mean, there's no point deploying all these workloads unless you're going to be able to connect to them. And so hybridizing your environment and creating a strategy with VPNs is pretty important. We spoke about certificates, deployment worksheets. Registration is something I haven't touched on with disconnected modes. So disconnected mode's a little bit more convoluted. In Azure, when you're connected to Azure AD, you can just click the button that says register and it registers. Registration in a disconnected mode, especially if there's some type of security classification, is a little bit more convoluted. So that when you run a piece of PowerShell to actually produce the registration token that you have to copy out of the environment, you need to take that over, take it over to another environment, run another piece of PowerShell against your subscription to then produce another token that says it's been registered against the subscription, and then bring that back into your environment. So I know you guys probably gone through the
RDS clearinghouse on the telephone. probably the thing that sort of springs to mind.
It's like licensing Windows XP over the phone, right? I think that's what you described here.
Similar, but you remember, like, if this is a highly classified environment, it can be challenging to get some of these things out. So just ahead of time, it's probably worth having that conversation and letting people know that you're going to do it, rather than just doing all your work and getting to the registration point and going, okay, now we've got to go talk to the security folk, and they're in shock and awe about what you're doing and the fact that you're trying to register something on the public cloud.
Watch you get the notebook out with a pencil and write down all the characters.
That's it.
The certificate block, so you can take it out.
You're obviously pretty handy with your ASCII writing, so.
I guess you mentioned worksheets. So there's obviously been some thought gone into some of this planning in terms of that. So some of the worksheets type stuff and some of the planning documentation that's available is probably going to make this a lot easier to come. But running a project to do it is the way to go.
I think the way you do this is, obviously there's a deployment worksheet. That deployment worksheet's really around providing that to your hardware partner to do the deployment. But then Microsoft Docs actually covers this all off, and it's sort of bouncing ball type stuff. I'd like to say it's really simple to follow, but it can be challenging. And I just sort of say, if you're going to go through and do registration or some of the certificate creation, you need to be really sharp on the way you read the site. Don't just scroll down to the headings and miss out on beginnings and some of the story up the front, which even myself, I have the I occasionally do, but there's some really important points in some of the documents about preparing before you actually start running code, which occasionally holds me back.
I guess the thing is about that registration is it's not something you do every week, right? So you're not going to get super practiced at doing that unless you're spinning out loads of stacks.
Yeah, so I guess the point here is like, and when you do register, you're actually able to unregister. You're able to, move around and re-register if you need to. So that's probably a good point on the registration conversation as well. And the reason that you need to register is the next point really comes to is you need a place to be able to one. They say when you're not registered, you're running the Azure Stack in a degraded state. It's hard to run things like updates. You can't run marketplace images and things like that. Once you're registered, you're actually able to run another tool. And again, this is in Microsoft Docs, which is called the Azure Marketplace Syndication Tool. And that syndication tool gives you access to be able to download marketplace images and extensions that are compatible with Azure Stack. So all the same types of marketplace items that you have in Azure, like Windows Server, CentOS, I'm just trying to think, Fortinet firewalls, all those types of network virtual appliances, you're able to download, bring them onto your Azure Stack Hub. Probably the other interesting thing there is the licensing discussion. If you do start bringing over external vendor solutions, like I say, a Fortinet firewall, or I don't know, an Ubuntu server, you're sort of tied into that provider for licensing as well. So it's not just sort of as you would in Azure, you sort of spin up this image and you do pay as you go. Yeah. Here you need to think a lot more about BYO licensing as well in disconnected mode. But yeah, look, all those marketplace items that are available and the extensions are pretty important to be able to run the ecosystem when you get them over. And that ecosystem of images and extensions allows you to run things like templates, which are in GitHub, to be able to deploy perhaps, Exchange servers, Skype servers, or whatever it might be, those solutions might be. And there's a whole stack of pre-ready, solutions out there that you're able to roll out across your Azure Stack Hub as soon as you've got these marketplace images in there. Supporting services, look, we sort of touched on the, I guess, the support conversation, but the other two things that I commonly have conversations about is one, Azure DevOps Server. So Azure DevOps Server is the same as, I guess, the Azure DevOps that you get as a public subscription. But you're able to run Azure DevOps basically on your server. There's a little bit more playing around with things like service principles and things like that. And again, happy to maybe have an automation chat a little bit later. Automation engine is an interesting one as well. So in a disconnected mode, you don't have access to Azure Automation. So thinking about how you maybe do some of those automation tasks and maybe using something like service management automation might be a conversation for you, or some type of other scheduled automation. And then, obviously we talked about Ops Manager, Config Manager, all those other types of services that you might need to perhaps build up your environment are pretty important there.
Ozzy, we do have a question here, which I might just throw in from the floor. If we have 4 required servers, DCs, ADFS, and PKI, but just want to run Azure Stack appliance, is there a recommendation against migrating these services to running on the stack? I guess that's sort of, if you think about the stack as pets or cattle, right? Is that sort of what that means to you?
It's chicken and egg type question.
Chicken and egg type question.
Yeah. So it's a good question, and it's something I'm actually working on a risk reduction activity at the moment. And I think if you're savvy enough, this is what I'm hoping at the moment. So I won't say I have a direct answer for that, but what I'm hoping is if you're smart enough with your network edge, where you're creating your VPN to be able to actually expose out a VPN connection, perhaps out to your router. I want to do a test where we can maybe hold some of these AD and ADFS and PKI services on the actual Azure Stack Hub itself. So you can actually self-boot, it creates the VPN connection, and then Azure Stack Hub see these services sitting there on the actual Azure Stack Hub fabric, instead of having to go out to perhaps another piece of infrastructure that you need to be able to deploy this as well. And we're going to maybe chat a bit harder now.
Yeah, I guess you can leverage all the security controls of the stack environment itself if you put things within, right? Rather than having to build them again outside.
Yeah. So, and that's another one. I mean, like typically the way people, when you build out these environments, like you've got AD sitting outside the environment, you've got an ADFS box and a PKI box at a minimum, right? You can create a second AD site inside your environment, and then you can do something like a migration to migrate maybe your PKI and your ADFS server into the environment as well. So I haven't done it yet, so I'm not going to say it's doable. In theory, everything's possible.
Yeah, is there a scenario maybe with the certification of it where they actually don't want you to touch the things that constitute the control plane for that sort of stuff, or is that not really?
No, they're not part of the control plane, and it's made to integrate with any type of environment that meets the requirement. I think the as long as it's the functional level is around 2012 R2, you're pretty much all right. So if you're above 2012 R2 on AD, I mean, like you can plug Azure Stack Hub in and integrate it with your environment, as long as you've got ADFS and PKI, I think at the same level as well. And then, it's just a matter of where you keep those services. So that sort of comes down to like some of the deployed type scenarios. So if you say wanted to deploy this on a ship and you were like had a constrained space and you didn't want to have extra infrastructure sitting outside of it, how do you solve that? And that might be how I was just sort of talking to about maybe trying to host some of these services rather than on another piece of infrastructure, outside the stack, host it internally within the stack. But that's something I'm testing at the moment. Maybe I'll write a blog on it when I get it done. So cool. Look, I might just move along. I know we're a bit over time, but I just wanted to touch on hardware quickly. And I might fly through this a little bit just so we can get through it. But so obviously hardware partners, VM constraints, capacity planner, form factors, and OEM discussion. Hardware partners, sort of picking a hardware partner, like really comes down again. I'll just say, like, it's what your business does and what your business requirements are. I think realistically, Azure Stack Hub is an appliance, so I'm not going to make any enemies out of any hardware partners by saying realistically it's deployed the same way as you're deploying it to use the cloud fabric. But if you're a HP shop or a Dell shop or whatever, a Lenovo shop, then it sort of makes sense to go with one of those things, because some of the tools that are used to manage Azure Stack Hub, like say HP OneView or I'm trying to think about what the Dell one is, but some of those similar tools will be used across those, especially for out-of-band management. There's also some really good conversations, I think, that aren't covered in our online docs that you should be having with your hardware partners around specific questions to do with hardware. So I've seen a couple of myths around there about Azure Stack hardware, about the fact that we need an OEM perhaps to, if we lose a drive, only the OEM can replace a drive. That's actually not true. Like if you talk to the hardware partners, they're quite happy, say around if you have a failed drive to maybe supply you with some supply you with some drives so you can replace drives. You can also talk to your vendors about doing things like in highly secure environments, maybe locking USB ports. The other conversation here is, like when we talk about the types of hardware, and I'll sort of talk about the hardware specs, if you've got if you want to be able to run GPU type workloads and AI and machine learning that wants that, those are things, that conversations that you can have with your hardware partner at ordering time. So I will point out for our friends, that are in classified environments that, look, there's guidance on ordering some of this equipment from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and just make sure that you're following that supply chain risk management process. So I might move on to the next slide. Cool. And I'd like to have this discussion here about VM constraints before we talk about the capacity manager. So in Azure Stack Hub, and if you check out this link that we've got up the top, you're constrained to using, and it's not just A-series VMs that I've got here, it's all I could fit on the screen.
Good. I was getting concerned there for a second.
But yeah, you're constrained to using a certain set of VMs, right? The set of VMs that you use on Azure Stack Hub is actually cut down from what's available in Azure. So it's what's available for that hardware. But I like to have this discussion, because when you look at these VMs types and you can sort of start to see what your IOPS are, what type of vCPUs you need, what type of memory you need for your VMs. Realistically, if you're getting really sharp on, preparing for Azure Stack Hub, is you might run something like an Azure Migrate over your environment to actually get some specs back on what your workloads look like, so then you can go through and do the capacity planner. And when you get those specs back from Azure Migrate, what you want to do is try and group them up into the machine families that you see, that are one available on Azure Stack Hub that you can use to, sort of be able to start mapping out what your capacity is going to look like. I'll point out the fact, I think with the max OS disk throughput, for some machines, I think it only goes up to maybe a max of 1,000 IOPS, I'm going to say. So when you start thinking about maybe putting higher end workloads on, SQL and things that are really going to hammer disk, you need to really make sure that you're not doing that perhaps on a single disk. You need to start looking at the, how you maybe spread that out with data disks and things like that. And I'll touch on expansion storage in a couple of slides as well. So how we can actually expand the storage footprint, to use some storage appliances as well. But this great spreadsheet here is the Azure Stack Hub Capacity Planner. And once you've done your discovery, like I said, via Azure Migrate or some other type of migration tool maybe, you can go through here and maybe pump in all your VMs and work out what your capacity is going to be in Azure Stack. This is a really interesting conversation that I have with people, because one of the things that you'd get, especially when we talk about mainly small Azure Stack deployments, is we get 4 nodes, but Azure Stack Hub and 4 nodes uses storage spaces direct, and it's part of like the update fault tolerance domains in the background. So how this storage significantly drops. So you want to make sure you're pretty accurate with your capacity, like working out what VMs you have, and then working out what type of machines you need to order. If you don't need super high-end disk, and like it's been my experience over probably the 10 that I've done that nobody's really needed anything crazy. I think going a hybrid model of SSD and maybe some NVMe storage and some SATA drives is probably the best approach, and it's probably what I talk to people about a little bit. But for most people, if you go to the capacity planner, work out what your workloads are, and we'll go from there. The OEM capacity planner examples. So I've run Cisco, Dell, and HP Azure Stack Hub deployments through the planners with the following specs, and I've just sort of highlighted a few things in this here, like the total raw memory on the 4 nodes. I didn't highlight CPU core totals and the total raw disk, and you can see, like on the left-hand side where we've got those raw specifications, they're actually quite high. But if we look on the right-hand side and we compare over to, and when you use the capacity planner, it sort of turns everything into gigabytes and terabytes. And gigabytes and terabytes are both smaller than gigabytes and terabytes. But you can see that your numbers don't start to add up pretty quickly. And what that is one, the cloud fabric actually takes quite a bit of resource to run itself. So from a CPU count, I think we reduced by about 80 CPUs to run the services that are running in the cloud fabric. The memory drops in some cases, like almost by half, like in a 4-node stack. I think the important thing to point out with this story is, like, once you've got that fabric up, it doesn't really increase. So when you add another scale unit, if you go to 5 or 6 nodes in your Stack Hub, you're not going to be consuming more CPUs for your infrastructure fabric or more memory or anything like that. But probably the thing that gets slashed the most is the storage, the disk storage. And that's because of the use of storage spaces direct and having a single scalable pool with all the disk devices except for boot. And those multiple virtual disks are basically put into a 3-way mirror. And so the fact that we're using mirroring there in a three-way standpoint really starts to chew up that disk storage. And that's why I sort of tend to tell people to go towards that sort of hybrid type scenario. So they're making sure that they're getting good disk space and not just a whole stack of SSD that's going to be mirrored around and probably not give them the performance for some of the VMs if they're not using the IOPS anyway. And that's about it. Look, the next one, this is a really interesting discussion at the moment, form factor. We've got, I think, 3 Azure Stack hubs on the left, and I think there's a Dell one, a HP one, and a Lenovo one. This is a pretty, typical deployment. I think, most of these are 8 nodes. Obviously, you can go down to 4 nodes and out to 16, and I've been told that shortly it might go out to 32 as well. So that's a bit of an update there. The Microsoft actually has, a hardened, ruggedized appliance that's available via Microsoft, which actually is a smaller deployment, obviously, than most of the other ones because it's ruggedized and it's built to be moved around. The modular data center is not available, I don't think, outside of the US at the moment. And I don't think the ruggedized Microsoft one is either. But I think if you talk to the local Microsoft people, maybe Nick and Stu or maybe Chris Burrows, if you want to have that conversation, they might be able to organise something for you. But I think, and this is where I get into NDA world because I've been dealing with all the vendors recently. But my expectation, I'll put it that way, is, and I've spoken to most of the vendors recently, is they all have smaller form factors coming out later on in 2021. So what I'm talking about is most of the time when you look at one of these deployments, you're sort of looking at a minimum of 12 rack units to maybe do one of these deployments. I think some of these will maybe get down to maybe around 5 RUs, but that's I can't guarantee anything. So, but I'll just throw that out there. We had this discussion earlier around the 4-node actual Azure Stack Hub appliance. Now, I've sort of done a blue box around this diagram on the left. That's part of the appliance. So a lot of people get a little bit upset after they deploy and they see this maybe BMC switch with, I don't know, maybe 20 extra ports that aren't being used. That's sort of bad luck. You don't get to use it for anything else. It's part of the hardened appliance. You can't change it. You can't do anything with it. And again, the servers are the same and those leaf switches are the same. Just quickly talking about resiliency, like there's built-in resiliency into this thing. So a lot of people sometimes comment on the fact that this takes 2 hours to start, which is, I think, mentioned on the Microsoft website. My testing's been around, like to actually get into portals, like usually it takes maybe about half an hour. But realistically, with all this switch resiliency, server resiliency, disk resiliency, and power resiliency, you can lose servers in this environment and still keep on operating in the same way. Where you start to get into trouble is when you get into like down to 3 servers and that mirror starts to break and it starts to look at maybe perhaps taking volumes offline, and that'll obviously have some of the services that you need in it. So it's just a matter of planning. Like I said, like if you've got your capacity right and those things right and you know what type of high availability you're after, it might not be 4 nodes that you're looking for. So I'll just go across these things quickly. There are options in this one, you're able to add additional scale unit nodes to Azure Stack Hub to increase your capacity. The caveat with that, and I'll just point it out, is your scale unit node must be absolutely homogeneous with the one that you've got. So if you've ordered a server with 32 CPUs and, 100 gig of disk and 20 gigabytes of RAM or something like that's probably pretty small, but it needs to be exactly the same. So you can't add in something, and it needs to be exactly the same down to the firmware levels to be able to scale out. The other thing I'll mention here is CloudAssert have got, CloudAssert actually a company I'm actually partnered with. They've actually got some great products that actually integrate. There's only a couple of companies that actually integrate into the as resource providers in the fabric that Microsoft allows. They've got one of their resource providers for Azure Stack Hub is called vConnect, and it integrates things like Dell Isilon storage for extended storage support as well. So you're actually able to extend out perhaps databases and things like that onto that storage. NetApp's been around for a while as well, and they're doing iSCSI, NFS, and SMB storage over there. External NetApp storage for Azure Stack as well. So you're able to do that. All you need to do is organize your networks. This is the management slide. So obviously we've sort of covered this off earlier, but Ops Manager covers off the management pack for Azure Stack Hub. That can be done for multiple Azure Stack Hubs. Nagios has an Azure Stack Hub plugin, and vendor tools such as Cisco, UCS Central, and HP OneView can monitor those things. And we're almost at the end. This is cool tools that Aussie loves, this section. Okay, so Azure, Cloud Assert have a product called Multi-Stamp Management. It's out now. So if you're looking to manage multiple Azure Stack Hubs, this is a great tool to be able to do this. So it's not only does the management and monitoring of multiple Azure Stack Hubs, you can update. So if you're managing multiple hubs, like perhaps, especially in disconnected mode, updating your marketplace where you download all your images, you can do this on one and replicate out to everywhere else. Your internal VMs, VHD management can also be done by this tool. You can push out, it can consolidate your usage and billing, especially if you're doing showback or chargeback internally, and obviously pulls together some of the diagnostics and alerts and tenant services as well. The other way, and Microsoft's coming out with this in private preview at the moment. I don't know exactly what the feature set is, but this is the link if you want to go and check it out online. Azure Stack Hub Fleet Management will do something similar when it comes out. I mean, this is out, it's in development, it's in preview, so I think you can request it from Microsoft. So if you want to perhaps look at doing the preview and you have multiple Azure Stack Hubs, contact Microsoft.
Is that kind of like Azure Arc? Is that similar to that? For me as a layperson who's not into Stack? No.
So it's more of a way to manage multiple stamps.
Oh, manage the fabric of the hub,
yeah,
not the things within it.
Yeah. So
right.
Azure Arc's more about sort of obviously pushing that policy out to the rest of the hybrid network. I didn't touch on Azure Arc today because I didn't think we'd have time, and we're already over time. So,
yeah.
But we're up to my last slide, I think, almost. So
right. We'll let you carry on. Yeah, we are having a bit of fun here. It's going to take time, but it's good.
So Commvault Live Sync replication from Microsoft Azure Stack Hub. So when you're thinking about doing multiple stacks, or even just doing backups, like this could be a great product for you. The fact that you can actually replicate across multiple stamps, this often comes up. So what I find is Azure Stack Hub gets compared to some of the virtualization people have on site and the way they're solving current problems, and a lot of that might be, say, VMware Site Recovery Manager type things, which is very common, very popular and stuff like that. So how you might sort that out, like if you wanted to have similar functionality on Azure Stack Hub, is via a tool like this. So like if you're looking around for that type of functionality, I just wanted to drop that in. But we're up to question time. I do like to hear myself speak, but we've got, I'm just wondering if anybody's got any questions. Love to be able to help people out if I can.
I actually have a comment from Daniel here. Rebuild times during Fabric updates are significantly faster on all Flash deployments, reducing maintenance windows.
Oh yeah,
something else to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think Daniel Apps is actually it might be on Azure Stack MVP, or I think he's an Azure MVP. So thanks for that, Daniel. Appreciate that.
Good comment, Daniel. Thank you. I don't have any more questions from the audience. Feel free to send them through if you do. So, like, if I want to get started with Azure Stack, if I'm like, yeah, I want to do this thing, what would I do? Would I go onto Microsoft Learn? Would I? How do you get started if you want to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think like if you're seriously looking into Azure Stack Hub, like the best place to start is probably Microsoft Docs. I follow quite a few people from the product group. Some of the links that I've shared here, what I might do is I'll share them with you guys and you can share them out to people. But some of the product some of the product team, Daniel Savage, Daniel Savage actually left the product team, but some of his team have actually done some great blogs on, sort of getting started and also, I guess, getting yourself into that headspace to be able to deploy Azure Stack Hub. But yeah, look, I usually start with Microsoft Docs and some of those things. And I think if you start Googling away, you can sort of do that. I think what I say to people is when they're starting, make sure they educate themselves really well. And like I said, drive it from a business requirement, and then it sort of everything else seems to fall into place. I see a lot of deployments start with, hey, Azure Stack Hub's the new magic beans, and we want some magic beans, and we want to put it in our data center, and it's awesome. People get excited about it. Everybody wants an Azure appliance, but there's quite a lot to consider. And this talk we've gone through quite a few things, but I think and there's quite a lot more to consider when you start drilling into some of these topics in depth. So the first thing I'd be doing is trying to educate yourself about what you're trying to solve. Microsoft websites point that out a fair bit, and some of the some of the team points that out a fair bit as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Product team, sorry.
Well, got to get myself an Azure region in the drop downs if that's how it shows, right?
That's it.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Disco.
Well, I guess from Nick and I and everyone who's been watching, thank you very much, Ozzy. We kind of been looking over at each other because we're kind of in the same room today, so it's quite weird.
But it looked a bit unnatural for everybody on the screen, so we apologise for that.
It's been quite a deep dive into what is something we could spend, lots and lots of hours discussing, I think. But certainly I've come away with a greater understanding. So thank you, Ozzy, for coming on. And I think we'll draw things to a close, I guess.
Yeah.
The next one, look, if you are looking for any particular topics, or you want to come on and present, show and tell something you've just learned. We're always looking for people to do that. It doesn't always have to be a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Ozzy, for PowerPoint. But I'm just, I'm a dev, so I'm quite happy to see the dev tools. We get the font size big enough and we show something cool. That's all great, right? So another shout out really to say sign up for Ignite, which is coming up in the next few days. There's going to be some, absolutely, tomorrow morning. So there's going to be some super cool demos. If you sign up for that, you should be able to see some recordings, I believe, of that cool stuff. And there's exciting things to come, I think. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll all do a double hand wave. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.